Megan. Welcome to Nerdy Policy Stuff, the show where I answer your public policy related questions in 10 minutes or less. Have a question about policy or government? Then leave it in the comments below and maybe I'll answer it in my next video. Today's topic was suggested by Liz and Shawnee, and it is on term limits and how they have empowered lobbyists. Term limits are a legal restriction on the number of terms individuals can serve in a specific position. There are two types of term limits: consecutive term limits, which is the number of consecutive terms that individuals can serve before they have to take a cooling off period, and then after they finish that cooling off period they can run again for the same position. And then there are lifetime term limits, which are limits on the number of terms you can serve in your lifetime. So in Oklahoma, the lifetime term limit for state legislators is 12 years of service in the House or Senate combined. They can't serve 12 years in the House and then serve 12 years in the Senate. It can only be up to 12 years in either house. Like our system of government, there are kind of two factors in term limits. There is state, and then there's congressional or federal term limits. And we're going to talk about state today because that's where most of the research lies, because we don't have congressional federal term limits. So in the 1990s, 21 states established limits on how long state legislators could serve. 6 of those have since overturned those laws, and now there are 15 states that have state legislature term limits. Those terms range from 6 to 12 years, and it just kind of depends on the state. You can find a full list in one of the links at the bottom of this page. There are 23 states that have passed federal congressional term limits. However, because of the Supreme Court decision of 5-4, those limits are not imposed because you had to have a constitutional amendment to make that happen. Non-Doc, which is an independent news source in Oklahoma, did this really great piece interviewing various Capitol insiders about term limits and its impact on our state legislature in Oklahoma. So what I found particularly interesting was several people, and it was all anonymous, several people said that term limits were actually a national plan to get rid of long-standing or long-serving Democratic state legislators. Interesting. But the consequences that they didn't foresee were that legislators have a lack of historic knowledge on policy and processes in Oklahoma government, and then they feel that there's more control by lobbyists and more influence by state agency bureaucrats. I would argue that detailed just a tiny bit with them, and that it takes power away from the people to make their decisions on who they want to be representing them. I agree with that one. So in the 90s, when all this was going on, to introduce term limits across the country, advocates touted that term limits would quell the amount of money and therefore the effect of special interests and groups. And so they touted it as kind of a campaign finance reform method. But did that happen? The theory we have today is that it gave them more power, so more control. So let's see what the research says. So there are several studies on the impact of term limits on states, but not a lot of studies on the impact of term limits on lobbyist influence. So one study that could probably answer Liz's question is by Apollonio, Glantz, and Bero, and it's specifically on the tobacco industry influence. So they hypothesized that term limits would cause lobbying groups to distribute campaign contributions more widely to a higher percentage of state legislators. And that, in turn, that would cause them to spend more money on campaign contributions. So they looked at both internal tobacco documents and campaign contributions between 1988 and 2002. And 2 states that they looked specifically at were California and Florida, because that's the most data, that's where they could find the most data. So what they found was Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds, the 2 largest tobacco companies, were actually having a disagreement about whether term limits were good or bad. R.J. Reynolds spent an exorbitant amount of money and created this secret PAC called Get Government Off Our Back in order to influence people to vote for term limits. Philip Morris spent money on trying to influence people not to vote to vote against the term limits. So the researchers found that in California, 80% of state legislators were actually receiving tobacco money for their campaigns in 1990, prior to term limits being introduced. And then it started going down till it was about 40% pre-1998. After 1998, which is when term limits began in California, it went back up to 60%. And the same thing happened in Florida. It was high, it went down, term limits came about, and then it went back up. So the data from the studies suggested that term limits increased this specific industry's access on legislators, and confirmed their hypothesis that they would spread out the amount of money that they were getting. But it didn't confirm that they would be spending more money on campaigns. In fact, it showed that they spent less. With that whole time range, 2002 was the least amount of money that tobacco companies spent on campaign contributions that year. So let's go back to that idea from advocates that were pro-term limits that said it would reduce the amount of spending on campaigns by special interest groups and therefore the influence by special interest groups. And technically it did reduce the amount of spending, but it didn't reduce the influence because actually they spent the same or less amount of money on more people. So therefore they had the same or more influence on more people. Oklahoma Watch issued a really interesting article this week about an increase in spending by lobbyists on gifts for legislatures. And they looked at ethics reports of meals, gifts, and beverages that legislators received from lobbyists this year and compared to last year. And they saw a 34% increase during the same time period. What is very interesting is that freshman representatives took roughly a value of $200 more on average than returning representatives. So I think that's fascinating, something to look into. Another thing that advocates said that term limits would do would decrease the amount of out-of-control spending by legislators. Jeff Cummins did a study specifically on whether term limits and the turnover produced by them impact overall state balance levels. So this is a little bit different than looking at out-of-control spending, but his premise is that out-of-control spending or spending more money by governments is not necessarily a bad thing unless they're spending more than they're actually taking in. I know that libertarians and Republicans would probably disagree, but that's besides the point. That's not what his study is about. Based on the literature, he presumed that legislators with term limits would have shorter fiscal outlooks, and that would make them more inclined to be riskier with their financial decisions. They would more likely cut taxes, spend more money without even thinking about the volatility of particular revenues that the state receives. Does that sound familiar? Cummins looked at annual budget data for general fund accounts from 1983 to 2008, pre-term limits and post-term limits, and then he also compared them to states that didn't have term limits, which was kind of a fascinating thing. And then he found that they actually do have a negative impact on the fiscal health of states. The average turnover in state lower chambers was 20%, and that resulted in a 1.41% decrease in fiscal reserves. Now, 1.41% does not seem like a very big number. However, the number that is recommended or is considered to be healthy or prudent for state fiscal reserves is 5%. And 1.41% is almost a third of that number. This doesn't completely answer Liz's question at all. Oklahoma Policy Institute did a really great data analysis on legislative turnover in our state a couple years ago, and the average experience for legislators prior to the passage of State Question 632, which was our term limit question, was 6.86 years. Compared to 2014, after, of course, it was 6.62 years. So it's not a huge difference in length of time of service. In the Senate, there was, and that's the average for both houses. In the Senate specifically, it was 2 years less. But in the House, it was a little bit longer in 2014 versus 1990. Interestingly enough, the tenure for legislators was actually decreasing before the state question was even passed. So more than half of legislators had actually served 4 years or less of service prior to 1990, and only 19 had served more than 12 years, except for, Gene Stipe, who actually served a whopping 53 years in the state legislature. And it's also the reason that most people voted for that question, because they wanted him out of office. So, term limits, are they good or are they bad? On the positive side, term limits do bring fresh faces, fresh ideas into the Capitol. That can be good sometimes. Incumbents can be really hard to get out of office. There are some real bad incumbents in office. There's always bad incumbents in office, but you can't honestly say that you have to have term limits just to get someone out of office. You gotta work hard to get new people in. They also prevent monopolies on elected officials and tyrannical forms of government. I think it's good to have a term limit on a president or term limits on our executive branch of the state government, the governor. However, there is some compelling research that shows that term limits are across the world tend to make executive officials act more rashly when it comes to war or violence or foreign policy, and so they're more likely to go to war when they're getting close to the end of their term, which is terrifying. So, there's that. And evidence is actually mixed on whether it curbs spending or not. Some researchers found that it does, some researchers found that it doesn't. So, on the negative side, term limits have increased access to legislatures by lobbyists because they spread their money around to more people. We saw that in Oklahoma. We've seen that in other states in some of the research. They also negatively impact the fiscal health of our states. We've seen that more than once in Oklahoma. So, that's that. There isn't a lot of research on the institutional knowledge of legislators and the social impacts on citizens, but I would surmise that legislators would be less likely to support the renewal or continuation of policies they don't have a lot of information on, particularly if they support welfare of lower income individuals and the legislator has a very big attachment to their party's platform. So there's that. Also, there was a story a couple months ago on copy and paste legislation, and outside influencing organizations would send legislation and our legislators would file it without so much thought as to the impact it has on our state. Now, if you look at the number of bills filed in our state as a total and the number of those copy and paste bills, the percentage is fairly small, but it only takes one to be an incredibly bad bill. Plus, I'm just really concerned about the fact that our legislators don't actually think about policies before they file legislation. You never know what's going to get through committee. So there's that. And I have seen some bad bills get through committee that weren't written by actual legislators or vetted by policy analysts. So what does this have to do with you? You have to vote. You have to vote every time in every election. And you know what? There's an easy way to find out when those are. You go to the Oklahoma Election Board and type in your name, your address, and your date of birth, and they will happily tell you when the next election is. They will even give you a sample ballot. And you can sign up to receive your ballot in the mail. You don't even have to go to the polling place. It's amazing. So yeah, you should do that. Also, talk to your legislators. Good grief. If you don't want them passing something, then tell them. They're not going to know unless you say anything. And they like to hear from their constituents because, they like to get reelected, and you're not going to reelect them if you know that they're doing bad things. Legislators are real people. They do human things, and so it's up to you to keep them accountable for their actions. And they're not going to know what you or your community or your neighbors or your friends or your family need unless you tell them. Not that scary. And there's a link below to help you figure out who yours is and who they are, and some resources and how to talk to them. Also, if you need advice on what to say, happy to help. So that concludes this video on term limits. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe for my next video, which will be on the death penalty. Yeah, it's gonna be so much fun. Sounds like a real downer, I know, but it'll be really interesting and fascinating as always. Thank you so much.